Welcome to the Silicon Slopes Live. We have Dr. Hannah Imlay, who is an infectious disease doctor at the University of Utah Health, and she is leading a clinical trial testing whether the drug Remdesivir is effective against COVID-19. Dr. Imlay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So recently there was some news about this drug that you're testing, Remdesivir. What do we know about how well it works so far?
Yeah, so we get information about new drugs from generally three kinds of sources. One of them is how well does this drug act in the laboratory? One is how does it act in animals? And of course, the last one is how well does it behave in humans? And does it help against viral infections in humans? That's obviously the most important question and the most important source of information that we get about it. So we know that in a test tube and in the laboratory, remdesivir was active. It's active against a broad range of viruses, actually, and that includes SARS-CoV-2. We also have animal data to suggest that remdesivir was active in animal models of SARS-CoV-2, as well as other coronaviruses like SARS-CoV-1 and MERS. And then the last and the hardest part is what do we know about how well the drug works in humans? There's been several clinical trials, and I think the most famous of which has been done by the NIH. And we don't have results of all those clinical trials yet, nor are all of them completed. The most famous of which of these trials was done by the NIH. It was a placebo-controlled randomized trial of remdesivir against placebo among patients with severe COVID-19. And so far what we have is a press release. And that press release suggests that patients who received remdesivir, it took less time for them to recover. And so that can be potentially a big deal. And it's hard for us to interpret some of those results without the full data available. And so we're all waiting very anxiously for the full data. And so I would say that those results initially are helpful, and they're hopeful that this is beneficial, but we won't know how much or in which patients this is particularly helpful until we have the full results of that study.
If we already have those results, or we're waiting for those results, why do we need another clinical trial?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are several trials that are ongoing. The one that I am leading is ongoing, but as remdesivir becomes more available, it may finish, actually. But there were several going in parallel, and they answer different questions. So the study that I'm in charge of is asking the question, is 5 days or 10 days better for severe SARS-CoV-2 infection? And actually, there's a separate trial that's asking in mild or moderate, is 5 days or 10 days or no remdesivir most effective in COVID-19 infection? And so they ask slightly different questions. And the trial that I'm a part of will help to answer what is the appropriate duration of therapy in patients with COVID-19.
The FDA has authorized emergency use of the drug. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the FDA has authorized emergency use. That's also called an EUA. What that means is in emergency circumstances where we don't have time to do the full regulatory procedures that we normally do with new drugs and new tests, the FDA can use an EUA to authorize use of this drug without going through the full regulatory processes. The perks to that is, of course, it's much faster. The problems with that is that, of course, we don't have all the oversight that we are normally accustomed to. So remdesivir ultimately will go through those longer and more thorough channels. But for the moment, this is what we have to start using and distributing the drug outside of clinical trials.
Will you be giving the drug to patients who are not a part of the clinical trial?
So that's also a good question. And some of these are somewhat unknown right now. This EUA means that we do have the ability to give the drug outside of the clinical trial. The problem is it's not widely available and there's not that much of it around. And so currently the federal government is distributing remdesivir to states to allocate to different hospitals in their state. So because of that process, we don't know if we will have remdesivir or how much we will have or for how many patients that will be a channel to get remdesivir through. So right now, we are currently giving remdesivir to patients only through a clinical trial.
So, as I understand it, remdesivir was originally used to treat Ebola. How does it work? How does it work?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, remdesivir does show activity against multiple viruses in the laboratory, and Ebola was one of them, and so was SARS-CoV-2. It works by acting against a viral enzyme that helps with its replication, so helps to create its genetic material. All of these viruses, SARS-CoV-2 uses RNA as its genetic material. We use DNA as our genetic material. And so this drug is active against the virus's enzyme that elongates its RNA and stops the RNA elongation and stops replication. So that's how it is supposed to work.
So what are some of the other treatments that are being tested right now?
So there's a lot of different possibilities for therapy, and most of them are being done through large clinical trials. We are taking part in a few of them. Certainly things like hydroxychloroquine are agents that are potentially promising, but we need clinical trial data to say, are they promising? And if so, how promising? Remdesivir, and then a lot of other agents that are meant to combat the human's response to the infection. So things like immunomodulation, like tocilizumab and sirolimus, are other agents that have been tested. Some blood thinners will also be tested in clinical trials nationwide. And so ideally, these are multi-center trials that are using large numbers of patients to be able to draw conclusions about the relative benefits of any of these therapies.
Not to put you on the spot here, but I saw a story, I think it was New York One or something like that today or yesterday, that New York University's Grossman School of Medicine, they did a trial, I believe, with 932 COVID-19 patients at local hospitals that said the drug hydroxychloroquine along with zinc sulfate, like the combination of those two things, that the study found that 44% were less likely to die when they took that. Does that sound, have you looked at that? Because I know they use doing their own hydroxychloroquine trial, which I believe is one of the largest in the country. And but I found that interesting, that this hydroxychloroquine along with zinc sulfate found that, at least this study from NYU found that 44% were less likely to die using that combination. I don't know if you have any comment on that or if you've even seen that.
I haven't seen that specific study. There's been a number of studies of hydroxychloroquine with with other things or not, with a variety of results. So some of them showing no effect, some of them showing more harm, some of them showing benefit. And so I think, again, it's these really big across the country multi-center trials that are randomized and placebo controlled that will give us kind of definitive answers and also be able to tell, is it effective in a subset of the population? And if so, how do we tell who those patients are? We are lucky enough to be a site for a randomized control trial, as you mentioned, a multi-center randomized control trial that is placebo controlled. And I think that will really help us to come up with some of those answers. So I think it's really exciting that we got to be a part of that.
And is it true that so far remdesivir seems to be the one that's showing the most promise?
It's difficult to tell because, again, we'll be able to have a good answer, 10 years down the road when all of this data is finally collated and compared against each other and things like that. So far, consistently, in the number of trials that we have, remdesivir does appear hopeful. And so I'm hopeful. And one other reason why I think that these results are very hopeful is that this trial, the NIH trial, was done as a randomized placebo-controlled involving an immense number of patients and in multiple countries. So I think the science done in that trial is probably quite good, and that we can actually draw good conclusions from once we actually see the data.
Right. What gives you, speaking of hope, what gives you the most hope in the months ahead?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things. I think one of the things that I feel, the most gratified about is seeing my colleagues, both in the infectious disease division, but also across the hospital, in the community, kind of banding together and coming up with strategies to keep patients safe in the hospital, patients safe in the community, to operationalize testing, and to come up with creative management strategies. I think that has been the most rewarding part of being part of the COVID response. And I hope that that continues. I think the other thing is the community has done a good job distancing, and I also hope that continues.
Right. Well, Dr. Imlay, thank you so much for taking the time. And I also just want to thank the University of Utah Health for everything that they've done during this pandemic. You've really led the state of Utah during all of this. I appreciate the work you're doing here. This clinical trial is fascinating. All of these clinical trials are fascinating, but like you said, I think with any of these drugs, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems like it's too soon to really know one way or another on effectiveness. And that's why we have folks like you doing these clinical trials. We can't thank you enough. Dr. Imlay, I'm sure we'll have you back on as this thing develops, but appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. It was good to meet you.
Thank you.